Hi, this is Eve Fairbanks. I'm of the New Republic and here with Rob Farley of the Patterson School at the University of Kentucky, I believe. I hope that's right.
Yeah.
Hi, Rob.
Yep. Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm very well.
So we are about to go on warp speed. We're taping this on Sunday night and about to kick off into a crazy few weeks leading up to Obama's inauguration, stimulus negotiations and the showdown in the Senate with Roland Burris and all this stuff kind of culminating in Obama's grand inaugural moment. And I wanted to just start off talking a little bit about the inauguration and what kind of tone it ought to strike. I noticed, so there's a whole lot of kind of concern about tone and the tone that the Democrats offer and the tone of Harry Reid towards Roland Burris and the tone that Obama strikes in his first meetings with Congress, which I guess are happening tomorrow, and then also with the inauguration itself. And a lot of concern that it be exactly right. You know, it's a sort of like a huge historical moment that's kind of seems to call for a lot of exhilaration. On the other hand, you have the deepening economic crisis, and there is this idea out there that I've heard a lot that the tone of the inauguration should be almost like wartime, more somber, so, you know, scaled down parties, and I wonder how that affects the inaugural speech itself. Obviously, Obama's, you know, we're not going to hear about it till it happens. He and John Favreau are holed up and just gonna kind of show us whatever they've got on the 20th. But I wanted to start off and ask what kind of, say you had a fantasy Obama inauguration speech, what kind of tone you think? And I'll just say real quick, I mean, there is this sense that there ought to be like a sobriety to the moment and a sense of the great weight upon his shoulders and the kind of huge, you know, the huge burden of all the screwed up things that he's receiving to take care of, the economy, what's going on in the Middle East. You know, things can seem dark, but I wouldn't want it to seem too somber. I thought his speech on Victory Night on November 4th was, to me, too kind of gloomy, and sort of his jaws were too set, and I kind of want to see him strike a broader theme of kind of, you know, maybe himself and how his own story, or if he can find some other story, still shows just the tremendous vitality of the nation and its capacity for rebirth, and some of this kind of a little bit more rousing, as opposed to, it would really be grim, I think, if he got into this kind of a John Edwards vein of, and I met so many people during the campaign who were suffering, and there's so much suffering, and the country's, you know, in deep crap. So,
Right.
but I don't know. Are you more for the sober?
Yeah, you know,
speech?
I guess in things like this, I prefer brevity. So, you know, I want him to deal with all of those things, and I want him to be sober and happy, and, you know, I mean, sort of the comparison with the Victory Night speech is really interesting, right? Because the Victory Night speech it's about two things, but it's more about thanking your supporters than it is about making the case to the people who didn't support you.
Right.
And I think the inauguration is obviously going to be, you know, it's going to have the same mix of that. But I think it has, and you know, that's why Rick Warren's going to be there. It has to be a little bit leaning on the other side, right? Right, making claims, or making arguments to the people who didn't necessarily elect you, but you know, arguing or making clear that you are their president too, and you understand that yourself to be their president too.
Yeah, I thought he did that during the Victory Night speech. Actually, I remember he said, you know, to all of those who didn't support me, I hope that I forget the exact language, but I hope that I can be a successful president for you too, or that your minds are going to be open, or, you know, he made some kind of what I thought was a nice gesture. Right. It was more and I had there was sort of argument over this, and I think I was on the minority side here, but he had this kind of, he didn't crack a smile once, or sort of, there was no elation. I guess maybe it would seem like gloating.
He had that nice, what was it he opened with? Hello, Chicago, and it felt like a rock band or something.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Hello, Detroit. Oh, wait, Chicago.
But what is the case that he could make? I mean, my plug-in to the conservative world is somewhat limited, but not as limited as it could be. My whole family is quite conservative, and I have friends along that line, and they're just very, they take a certain pleasure in not being touched by the Obama magic. So I think it's hard for him, because on the one hand, if he offers some really stirring, very kind of rhetorical speech, you feel that's kind of what he can deliver, because that's the kind of thing that he's known for at his best. On the other hand, then that kind of, there's a pleasure that some conservatives take in being immune to that, and saying,
right, and sort of being serious, right? That serious people aren't, and it's not just conservatives. I mean, I think that there were other claims made along those lines, especially during the primaries.
Right.
People arguing about sort of his rhetorical style, but it is an interesting thing, because obviously his rhetorical style is one of his strengths, and certainly, I mean, he understands that there were 3 huge speeches he was going to make in this campaign, and there was well, beyond the ones he sort of incidentally had to make. But the accepting the nomination, the victory night speech, and then this speech, right? I mean, he's going to have State of Union addresses, down the road and so forth. But this is going to be more viewed than any of those, right? It's going to be taken more seriously. So yeah, I mean, it is really interesting to think about which way he's going to go. I mean, I guess my guess would be that sort of the historical uniqueness of his victory is so well understood already that he's not going to feel the need to remind people of that. And so my guess is that he's actually just going to try to bring people down a little bit, not down into mass suicides across Washington D.C. or anything like that, but to sort of tone that down, because he understands it's a strength, but he also understands that that he's he's not only a presidential candidate, he's the president. So I mean, you're in D.C., right? I mean, so are you going to it, or am I wrong about that?
I am D.C., and I hope I'm going to it. Press credentials are, they have 10 times the number that that were requested for poor Bush's second inaugural in 2004, and 10 times the requests and the same number of credentials to hand out. So we'll all see. We're all kind of in the bread line for our meager allotment of credentials. But right. I'll be on the mall if I'm not up in the press stands. So bring people down. I don't know. I mean, I think you're right that this is a moment for him, a little bit like the 2004 convention. I mean, he made it. He's president now. He doesn't, to my mind, he doesn't have to worry as much about, dampening the messianic kind of ridicule that was hitting him during the primary. There was all this sense that, that was going to be the downfall of him, and people were going to get a load of his supporters and how cultish or whatever they were and run screaming in the other direction. And obviously he withstood that problem, and there's something very real about his appeal. His approval ratings are like the highest, 75% approval.
Something like that. Approval.
Crazy,
Right.
In
what has been a very difficult interregnum period, right? And just sort of on a personal note, I find it almost crazy how long ago November 4th seems right now. It feels like it was like 2 years ago, something along those lines. And I can't believe George Bush is still president. And I guess I do harbor hostility towards the guy, but, it's just, I wake up in the morning and George Bush is still president, and it's like, whoa, it really is a long time between Election Day and Inauguration Day.
Yeah, his lame
everything
duck.
happens in the world.
Maybe everyone's is like this to some extent, but it's just been so weird. My mother, amazingly, is on the White House Christmas card list. I think because of all her donations to the RNC or whatever. Now it's auto-signed, so it's not like she got a handprint with a lipstick kiss print from Laura herself or whatever, but she's on like the B tier Christmas card list, and it's this kind of amazing image of a like the view out from the White House, I think it is, towards the Washington Monument, towards one of the major D.C. buildings, and the sun is setting, and there's like somebody walking off into the distance, and it's very kind of elegiac and weird, but...
Right. So, I mean, do you think you you opened your statement with the question about tone? I mean, do you think this stuff matters? Do you think that the tone that he establishes early on, is this really going to make a difference, or can he make a serious mistake at this point in terms of the goals of his administration by setting the wrong tone in Washington, or can he do really well by setting the right tone? The reason I ask is, I'm a political scientist.
There has been so much obsession over tone. I think there was this Washington Post piece today, and it was talking a little bit more about how his administration is going to try to impact the tone on Capitol Hill, which is obviously very bitter and negative and not being helped by some of this Roland Burris stuff, and now Franken continuing, fight to the death, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know. I mean, the question is how much he can kind of himself alter the way people behave up on the Hill just by the kind of inspiration of his presence. And I don't mean that to sound all goo-goo gaga, but I think that can be a factor. I mean, right. I would think of two things, On the one hand, I think of the Henry Waxman energy fight, which, the fight that Waxman pitched with Dingell over the control of the energy panel in the House. And that seems like a bit of a random segue for me to bring up. But, I remember thinking and talking with people in my office that the Blue Dogs, those are the very conservative Democrats, were all going to probably, or our energy guy who writes for us particularly thought that they would all go for Dingell because he's more kind of, seems like a more natural ally policy-wise. And it was somewhat of a surprise. I remember I was there standing, kind of staking out the outside of the room where they were all voting on that, and it was a surprise when word emerged that Waxman had won. And I think, the ballot is secret, but one of the Blue Dogs, a new guy named Frank Cradaville from Eastern Maryland, an interesting guy, came out. I did a story on him. I know him a little bit, and we were talking, and he said, he thought the Blue Dogs were really split, and there was a sensation like they wanted, they were inspired by Obama and the Obama election, and they wanted change. They wanted to get onto this, like, more kind of progressive, get things done, kind of change bandwagon. And they saw Henry Waxman as, well, he's not remotely a conciliator. He is, in a certain way, in the Obama mold, in that he's this legislator, some of the Clean Air Act, some of these huge things the kind of legislation that Congress doesn't pass anymore, these kind of, where government's really doing something, or, to solve these problems or whatever, that he was a representative of that. So a lot of them obviously backed him. And I think, the very sort of existence of Obama facilitated that to some degree. I don't know to what extent what Obama does. He kind of is what he is, and he's so consistent, so it's hard for me to see him tonally. Yeah, he's so unflappable, tonally screwing up. I mean, he does have very high expectations, though, and I wonder what you think of that.
Well, I think it's such an interesting, and, talking a little bit about the interregnum, it feels like the most disastrous interregnum since, I was thinking about the other day, and so, what
I
other
mean,
stuff
with
has
like
happened?
Blagojevich.
Right. Well,
Oh.
not just Blagojevich, but suddenly there's a war, and the economy
Right.
continues to collapse at, full speed. Afghanistan, a whole bunch of stuff. And I was thinking back to really how many other disasters have happened. You can't really say that Blagojevich is a disaster that happened before November 4th, right? In a sense, but it really came out after November 4th. I was trying to think back what are the worst things that have happened between November 4th, or between the election and the inauguration, in terms of giving the president a real sense of crisis when he comes into power. And I guess there was the 1992 with Somalia, with President Bush authorizing the use or the deployment of troops to Somalia, which sort of created problems for the Clinton administration. Which sort of people darkly hinted back then that was the intent, was to create problems for the Clinton administration. But really nothing like this. And sort of thinking back to 1982, or 80 as well, and you have stagflation, and you have the hostage crisis and the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. All those were sort of things that had developed before the election and that led to Carter's defeat. But at the same time, they aren't stuff. I guess they're sort of like the stuff that's happened in the last 3 months here.
Right, and yet it's very odd that,
Right.
People are very happy with.
Right.
There's a thing about Obama, and sometimes I find it annoying, I have to admit, which is that he manages to kind of keep his hands very clean and stay very clear of a lot of the crap that other people are getting kind of mired in and putting out statements that commit them. I think of, for example, the war in Georgia in August, which is something that I think we had wanted to talk about a little bit too. But I think of that war in Georgia, and, I was no fan of McCain's sort of wacky, headless chicken, belligerent,
So you didn't feel you were a Georgian too?
Well, my father lives in Tbilisi, so in a certain way, I'm a Georgian, but more than you are, and more than McCain is. I'll say that. Although I guess his Randy Shinneman was on their payroll, so that maybe makes him one too. But no, that was a little bit nutty. On the other hand, Obama's kind of way of dealing with that, and I guess he was a little bit in maybe some circles, but I don't think universally kind of hit a little bit for his reaction, which was sort of swerving. But he just, he's a sort of master of the vague statement and the kind of that doesn't.
But if you already like him, you can assume that, or whatever he says, you can assume that he's on your side.
But he manages, I think, and he. Right now he can, I hesitate to say hide behind, because that sounds like he has like a bad motive or he's a coward. But this line, which I have to say I'm getting so tired of. I understand the purpose of it, but we have only one president at a time.
Right.
And, so every kind of thing that explodes and every piece of doo-doo that hits the fan, he says, well, I'm very concerned, but we have only one president at a time. And that's the kind of, he manages to sort of float
right. Well,
above a lot of this stuff.
I think he's used that line a lot, and I think
right.
as successfully as he can in reference to the Gaza crisis, right?
Right.
The Gaza crisis would be one, especially, given the construction of his coalition, even though sort of the Democratic elite is very, very pro-Israel, I think Democratic voters more generally are a little bit more divided. And so it does represent just a, sort of a political problem for him. And he's used sort of that line, I think that line has been very helpful. But
it will cease to be helpful when the one president that there is at a time becomes him.
yeah, exactly. I wonder though, I don't, sort of off the top of my head, and we're talking about pretty profound technological change, but I don't and I guess 2000 is a really bad situation because Bush really wasn't positive that he was going to be president-elect until mid-December. But is it common for president-elects to be as active as Obama has? I mean, I'm thinking here of the weekly YouTube events or the weekly YouTube addresses. And of course, his transition has moved very, very quickly in terms of, although I guess they need a new Commerce Secretary now.
Yeah. Where did that come
from? Yeah, right. I mean, that kind of surprised me. I just saw it on the news and saw, whoa, Bill Richardson's out. And so, I don't know whether that makes the fact that his transition has moved at a very fast rate and seemed very professional, and that he has had a very public presence in it in terms of the YouTube addresses, in terms of laying out very clearly what he thinks legislation should be, and sort of pushing for that in the very short order. And I wonder if that makes the statements on foreign policy seem just a little bit more disingenuous, or if there really is sort of a difference here. There really is a difference between the president's role in foreign policy and the president's role in all of these other things, such that it really would be more detrimental if Obama attempted to step up in terms of making different foreign policy statements right now. I really don't know. Or if there's just really nothing different that he would have done than the Bush administration up to this point, in terms of what's going on in Gaza, what's going on with piracy and Mumbai and everything else. And maybe that's just the case, that there isn't a profound difference between what his positions would have been and what the Bush administration's positions actually are.
Yeah, well, that was certainly, I did a dialogue a few weeks ago with Matt Continetti on here, and he was very, very pleased that to determine that there was going to be very little to zero difference in Obama's foreign policy with Bush's, which is certainly not exactly true, I don't think, but his hands are tied by a lot of the same binds, I think.
Right. I mean, the international system remains the international system, and the United States does not have full freedom of action. But I really don't buy the neocon line on that. I mean, they've sort of made a very concerted effort to argue that he won't be any different than foreign policy. And I think that's wrong. I mean, I think we'll see big differences on Cuba policy. We'll see big differences in some other places, too, pretty quickly. Whether we'll see differences in Israel policy is, I think, an entirely different question. But.
Yeah, and it's also, I think it's a little bit silly to say, so he's retaining Gates, but Gates is not the person who really defined the Bush presidency's military strategy and approach in Iraq. That was Rumsfeld, right? Gates was sort of an import towards the end, a kind of a Band-Aid. I think it's more of an unknown. It's one of these unknowns about him, how his foreign policy will really manifest itself, and how, for example, I was just reading today some about Russia, and that's been a little bit on the news back burner just in the last few days because of what's happening in Gaza, but they are, Putin and Medvedev and so forth, are trying to kind of assert themselves, and there's this idea that maybe they'll test Obama, or some of this Ukraine gas embargo stuff is kind of feeling their oats, or whatever, and it's just really, it's so hard to know. There is a fascination in Russia, as there is all over the world, with Obama, but I don't know if it's the same thing as respect, this intrigue with him, or whether they'll, to what degree they'll see America differently because it's headed by Barack Obama. I was just spending New Year's with a friend who covers Russian politics from Moscow, and there's a lot of problems with immigration and also race in Russia. So race problems there, not dissimilar to the kind that we've had in this country at times. And so there's these two. He says there's these two kind of impulses there. One is, wow, they got rid of Bush. That is, that's amazing. Obama's going to be so different. He's a global president. He's the president of the world instead of just America, etc. He's not neo-imperialist or neocon, whatever that means now. And then the other is, and I'm not sugarcoating this, is like, wow, that really verifies our impression of silly Americans that they elected a black guy as president.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. Russia didn't exactly do badly during the Bush years. There were some aspects of what you might call the neo-imperialist foreign policy, especially missile defense, which Russia really didn't
do
like.
Badly. You mean they didn't make out badly, or?
Yeah, no. Russia had, I think, substantial economic growth.
Right.
Until the last year, in which nobody's had economic growth, they did extremely well from the general refocus on fossil fuels, and they're still doing well. They're not doing so well because of the collapse in price of oil, but they did very, very well from the high prices of oil as well as anybody. And so it's sort of interesting to me that the
Is
Russian
any of their
view,
success due to Bush's soulmate connection with Putin? That they had this soul level kind of bond?
Who knows, right? What did McCain say, that he looked in his eyes and saw KGB?
The letters K, G, and B, and he said that at every freaking rally. I will tell you.
But like China, I think that the last 8 years have been relatively successful in terms of Russian foreign policy and in terms of Russia's domestic construction, or the Russian state's domestic construction of how it wants Russia to look like. And so, if I were Russian, maybe I would look fondly back at the Bush years. Certainly more fondly back at the Bush years than the Clinton years, when sort of everything went to hell. And so that's really curious. It's interesting you mentioned the testing thing, too, because I was kind of surprised that Medvedev took such an aggressive stance on putting the missiles next to Poland right out of the gate, right after the election. It really surprised me because it didn't seem to make sense. I mean, it seemed to me to look like an effort at intimidation of the United States, right? We're going to intimidate you into not deploying this missile defense system. But with somebody like Obama, who's already pretty sketchy on missile defense, and I think rightly sketchy on missile defense, to make it look like then he was backing down if he withdrew the missile defense offer from Poland, it seemed to me it made it harder to remove the missile defense system when Medvedev was making those very aggressive statements and the very aggressive actions in early November. But I don't really know why.
It reminded me that there was an old Soviet slogan which was American encirclement, when that was a loose translation, and that was always a fear, when there were troops stationed in Germany and Italy and kind of on all the borders. And I think that's still a kind of the sense of American encirclement. So with American kind of, I don't know, you could say meddling or involvement in Georgia, right. And strong American involvement, although behind the scenes and oblique, in, say, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine and in that country, and then the missile defense, and I think that it's a really old impulse to sort of really lash out strongly against that kind of thing, but
right. Yeah, no, I mean, I get that, but the timing was curious to me.
Yeah.
Anyway, I mean, you said you were recently in Tbilisi, so what is post-war? Speaking of Georgia, what is post-war Georgia? What's the gestalt of post-war Georgia?
What's the gestalt? Well, it's hard to say. I mean, it was the first time I've ever been in Tbilisi. I was there in November, and and it's an amazing country. I would encourage you to go there. It's not really a hot tourist destination, but it's so easy to go, and Tbilisi is absolutely beautiful, and you can go up so easily, just up into the Caucasus Mountains, even up to the border of Chechnya, and up the main road up to the border of North Ossetia, although you can't get into South Ossetia right now, I don't think. But and there are barely signs that there was a war. There's a neighborhood in Tbilisi called Vake, which is kind of reminds me of parts of Paris or St. Petersburg, or, it has the Louis Vuitton stores and the cafes and the Segafredo Tbilisi, and, it has a sort of prosperous look in some ways, but it was striking too, the sort of grim attitude. There seemed to be a belief, and my father's a professor there at a university, and we went out with his students and also fellow teachers and other people in business or whatever, and there was like the universal and strong belief that they will eventually, and not too far from now, be again under Russian direct control, that like their country is going to disappear, which, I guess seems sort of unlikely to me, but they hate Saakashvili. He was much more loved by McCain than by any actual, real Georgians.
Right.
But on the other hand, they also hate Putin. I mean, it was striking here, and I would hope, that the advent of Obama, who's in some way somewhat untinged by some of this stuff, this sort of Bush-era squabbling, can sweep this away. But how much the reaction to that war here, stateside, kind of fell into this easy mode of debate and argumentation that was shaped by the Iraq War. So on the one hand, you have like McCain running around, we're all Georgians, we must free them, this tiny country under an evil oppressor or whatever, right? Where America is supposed to be on the side of democracy. And then on the other hand, you had sort of like, anyone who sides with Georgia is a neocon, and the desire to help them is sort of neoconservatism, and the kind of mistakes that we made in the run-up to the Iraq War. I think of The Nation magazine, which I sometimes like, but they were to some degree like a sort of example of this, and they had a guy who published more than one kind of angry article about
Ames, right?
Yeah, Ames, Mark Ames, who's a fascinating character. He ran a magazine which has been shut down that was like totally raunchy and raw, and it was about prostitutes in Moscow, like just tons of prostitutes, and he wrote actually some stuff which about the kind of degradation of sex there in the 90s, and that I remember being interesting. But he then got on this bent for The Nation, which I thought was sort of, it just was as silly as the McCain response, and so colored by our own experience in the Iraq War of, so the New York Times took this neocon line where they wanted to see Georgia as the poor democratic victim and vilify the Kremlin, which, and it's actually evil Georgia. And, but then you got over there, and it's sort of like, there's a lot more in common between Georgia and Russia. It's like two people in high school who really hate each other because they're too much alike, and they see what they don't like in each other. I mean,
right. Well, I mean, I think that, and you probably know, and certainly your dad knows more about this, but I mean, Georgians, ethnic Georgians were high within the Russian imperial hierarchy, and they were high within the Soviet Union in terms of being bureaucrats and so forth.
Oh,
and so the cultural connections were very tight.
Well,
it's
Stalin,
interesting.
I mean,
what's that?
Stalin.
Oh yes, including
the biggest one of all.
And I believe Beria was also from Georgia.
I didn't know that.
It's interesting that you mentioned this because I was called out by name in the New Republic, no less, for being insufficiently. I think I wrote something like, "It's hard to tell who's at fault right now." And David Greenberg actually published something, and people like Robert Farley, who writes at the American Prospect, say it's too hard to tell what's going on right now. And I was called out for being insufficiently pro-freedom.
Really?
I'm still bitter about that, and I've in fact challenged him to a blogging heads on that very issue, and he has thus far rejected my challenge, or actually not responded.
You're like those guys who protested the freedom fries in the House cafeteria.
Right.
It's
I mean,
basic.
yeah. Right, and I mean, he waxed very poetic, right? As tiny Georgia is crushed by monster Russia, American liberals can view this only through the lens of Bush's imperialism, and so therefore Russia or Georgia must be evil to them. And I found that irritating, and I still do, because I think the more we know about it, the more complicated the situation becomes between Georgia and Russia.
Yeah, and part of that, I think, is, there were journalists over there who, there's kind of a desire, I mean, I don't mean this to sound sort of sick, but like the desire for a story about genocide, or a kind of black and white story with a character who's a villain and one who's a kind of David and Goliath hero, which could be Saakashvili, but if you were over there, you knew that was a little bit ridiculous, and I think it's come out since that both sides massively exaggerated their claims. Like the Russians initially said, 2,000 killed in Sink Valley, or something like that, and they maintained this in the face of evidence for a long time, and then they just recently did an official report saying, well, okay, final number is 169, which is like,
right.
That is a difference of magnitude, right. Order of magnitude. Yeah. But then, and the New York Times was the paper that later, several months after the fact, but did do some strong reporting on this, saying basically the tapes and the evidence now show that this was Saakashvili's sort of attempt at heroic romantic incursion in the first place, but then it was not unprovoked earlier, and it is very kind of gray, and I hope that, that's one of my hopes, I guess, for Obama's presidency, is that we can leave some of the lenses that I think, both somebody like David Greenberg, but also Mark Ames, The Nation, are using in terms of kind of seeing people as divided into these two camps, and the ones were those who either were pro-freedom / Bush imperialists, and then the other is appeasers / heroic kind of believers in diplomacy and anti-interventionists, or, that's too simplistic, but I think there is this like framework, and it's tiring to kind of play these roles,
Right. Going a little bit back, it is sort of fascinating to me because, I think,
I'm sorry, by the way, for your slander in my rag.
Well, I mean, I haven't seen a correction printed. It is sort of fascinating, when we talk about sort of mirror imaging Saakashvili and Putin, that what the Georgians did do extremely successfully, and pretty much the only successful aspect of their war effort, was they mastered that narrative, right? They mastered that lens that you just talked about, in that they seemed almost perfectly to understand American politics, in sort of in their sense, and the rhetoric they used, it seemed very well prepared,
right.
And Saakashvili knew exactly, he spoke good English, right? All the people on TV spoke good English. They knew just exactly how to make the claims that would spur sympathy. And they had just
there was
masterful.
A kind of iconic photo of him, and in retrospect, makes him look small and ridiculous. But he was like in a crowd, and he was ducking because there was gunfire, or there was a cluster bomb, or that was the claim. Right. That was like one of the first photos of that war, and it was kind of like, the embattled small people that placed their faith in America and had their soldiers trained by America, and now America's going to abandon them because of our bad experience in Iraq, and isn't that, terrible of us, etc. I think that's right. I think that's a good point.
Right. And yeah, it was fascinating to me. And I wonder, if they thought very consciously about that, or if they just sort of lucked into it, or what exactly. But, I mean, they did very well in that sense. So.
He does, and I think if I think of the, Moscow press corps, which a few of whom I know, their impression of Saakashvili has turned into a sort of comical one, like this strutting comical. So maybe his strategy, which I think is extremely West-oriented. He went to Columbia. He does have this this strong desire to kind of form the narrative of his little country and himself as the kind of founder of it in the Western press. There's a hilarious piece in Slate, which you should read if you haven't. It was a total don't miss about this travel writer. It was published during the Georgia War, I think, as a kind of peg. But this travel writer, like a totally kind of no-name stringer travel writer who was in Georgia, and somebody realized she was in Georgia, and Misha, as they call him, phoned her personally and invited her to come jet skiing with him, and then she found themselves drinking cha-cha, which is the Georgian aquavit, and dumplings, and, Misha was regaling her, and she was a little bit stunned, like, what the hell is going on here? Why is he giving me this attention? But it is this effort of his. But I think of, you sent this article to me, actually, and it was totally fascinating. It was published just a few days ago, but by Ellen Barry, who's great, in the Times. And it was like it was catching up with Misha in Georgia, basically. And it does reveal how totally, incredibly U.S. directed his whole line of thinking was. I mean, he says, and he seems very kind of strutting and sort of like a man who had these grandiose, Henry V or kind of nation-founding ambitions, and, what he's actually been able to do is smaller than that. But he said that initially he had wanted to model himself after David the Builder, who you hear about a lot, actually, when you go to Georgia. It's a kind of, it's a romantic society there. There's every dinner that you go to has people really sing. They bring like guitars to restaurants. There's a whole toast ritual where people toast the motherland, and they use that word quite like unironically. But and David the Builder was, I think, 13th century, around then, kind of the founder of the medieval kingdom of Georgia, which was very flourishing civilization. Right. And in this article, I would love to know what you thought of this article, but it had Misha saying, I've scaled back my ambitions. I no longer want to be David the Builder, sung about in troubadours' songs for generations to come. Right? Now I just merely want to be George Washington now. George Washington,
okay.
Yeah, right. George Washington, while he was a glorious founder and a mighty general, and he did not want to be king, and he gave up power peacefully, and he realized the limitations of himself as opposed to David the Builder, who was a sort of, proto-emperor, So,
right.
So my ambitions are reduced, but it was totally, it was just something made to be printed for
when you're choosing between near mythical
up.
lawgivers, right? I mean, that's the sort of the fascinating, the fascinating comparison there. So, it's going to remain interesting, right? And I just recently read about a little bit about this new strategic relationship agreement between the U.S. and Georgia and what exactly it means. One thing that's kind of interesting to me about it is I'm very interested in conversations about military doctrine and strategic doctrine. And the Russia-Georgia war is sort of proving a very interesting narrative within the strategic community, right? It's actually a narrative that's being used to argue against multilateralism, because it's,
really?
Well, look, it's look, what did this 1,000-ship navy get us? What did this NATO thing get us here? We weren't even able to stop Russia from invading Georgia. And this is where multilateralism leads us. And it's a fundamentally dishonest narrative because, of course, we could have tried to intervene in the war. It would have been absurd and ridiculous and incredibly destructive, but NATO didn't exactly stop us from doing so. But it is being used as a narrative about sort of the renewal of threats and how multilateralism fundamentally can't be an answer to those threats.
Do you have any sense, and I should probably wrap up soon, but Obama's particular advisors, so the people who are, I guess, people like Rice or Steinberg or Jim Jones or whatever, have any of them weighed in on this? Do you have any kind of general impressions of the lessons that they took from Russia, Georgia, or that they're kind of taking from it now, if any?
I really don't.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really good question. I don't know exactly sort of where they're going. But anyway, we were going to talk a little bit about the Senate situations, which I think we can still do in like 4 minutes.
Yes. Senate situation, totally crazy. It's hard to know. I feel like Harry Reid is being completely mau-maued right now. The Republicans. And I used to be a defender of Reid, and I still, I like him personally to the extent that I've ever interacted with him, which is minimal. I love his press secretary. I think that guy, Jim Manley, has a lot of impact on how Reid is covered because he's so helpful and he's so nice, which maybe is a bad thing from a media point of view. But yeah, I mean, he just somehow seems to open himself to this, like, consistently to this kind of Republican mau-mauing. Now they're saying, well, you have to seat Roland Burris because Harry Reid is a racist. Did you hear this line?
I mean, I've heard the line of argument. I hadn't heard the Republicans especially making it, but
yeah, it's in totally bad faith.
Right.
It's just ridiculous. But
right, and then he came out against, or apparently he lobbied Blagojevich into not picking Jesse Jackson Jr. for some reason. Or that's
no
what
Jesse
I read.
Jackson Jr., no Emil Jones, and no Davis or Daniels. So, Danny Davis. And those three are black Illinois politicians. So now and it becomes Harry Reid thinks blacks are unelectable, even in the age of Obama. So he doesn't, and I don't even know what to make of it. It's just so it's such a freaking mess, and I almost feel like, I mean, doesn't Roland Burris kind of have to be seated?
Yeah, the legal arguments appear to be incredibly complex and beyond me. So I really haven't the faintest about whether they have to seat him or not. I do wonder whether in the future, I guess I want to do two things. One, are more states going to move to a special election system rather than a gubernatorial appointment system? And I actually talked to some politicos from Kentucky about that yesterday, and maybe there's no difference between Kentucky or Illinois on this point, but they said that in Kentucky exactly the same thing would have happened regarding the Blagojevich, except that no one would have cared because that's simply how things are done in Kentucky. So.
Right.
So I want, and I guess maybe the answer is then that governors won't give it up because it is such a golden thing, is having this ability to name senators. I wonder, though, in the future, if presidents are going to become a little bit more sketchy about nominating senators to cabinet positions, right? I mean, they already don't nominate when they fear they'll lose the seat, but just sort of the Illinois disaster and the the ongoing Illinois or New York saga.
New York drama, right?
Right. Whether a future president or even the current president, when the second administration rolls around, or when he needs a commerce secretary, for example, will say just I'm not going to bother with all the trouble that this involves of appointing a sitting senator because it just seems to be a disaster every time. Although I guess Colorado handled it okay, although I've heard some criticism. But I guess, Delaware, too, there was criticism there, although that was a vice president rather than a cabinet, so.
Well, it has. I mean, there's something about these senatorial appointments and I don't have a strong memory for past, whether there's been kind of meltdowns like this in the past. Appointments can always be controversial. Somebody had an illegal immigrant as a nanny or something like that, but it shows this kind of seamy underbelly of, these ways in which our system is not that democratic, right? In New York, you have someone who believes, I think, to some extent, and her cadre believes that she's entitled to this seat to some degree dynastically, although I'm sure she also strongly believes that she deserves it, and that she's worth it, and that she'd do a good job, which I don't necessarily doubt. And then in Illinois, you have this thing just being put up on the open market, and I do believe that, I maintained that the greatest error that Blagojevich made was not to, attempt to shake down Jesse Jr. or whatever, but was to use so much profanity. Because,
It makes it sound so much more interesting.
It
right?
did. It made it seem so much dirtier and more
yeah.
like Nixonian and so much more salacious and tabloid fodder and great for the New York Post headlines and all that kind of stuff. Whereas I think, it was just a little bit more shameless of a version of something that happens all over the country in all kinds of appointment situations like this,
Mm-hmm. Right.
It is a effing valuable thing, and I doubt other people in his position would have given it away for absolutely nothing. Maybe they would have held out for a slightly more honorable, policy promise or something like.
Right. No, that would have made it more noble. Right. If give me more highway funds for Illinois or something like that, rather than more for election funds and a job for my wife. The Blagojevich is just cinematic, though. I mean, that's part of the thing. The hair and just his way of speaking, and that makes the whole scandal just fun. And I guess that's sort of the worst thing for a scandal to be for a particular politician, if it's fun.
Right.
Right. The Lewinsky thing was fun. Right, it was all fun.
Spitzer was fun because of the socks, and his little. It's all in the details. It's like a director would have great, these little juicy shots that you can do of Blagojevich with his black Paul Mitchell hairbrush, and how he called it the nuclear football and couldn't go anywhere without it.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly.
It's not kind of boring. I think you're right.
Right.
Well, this has been great. Maybe just to wrap up, I wonder. It's kind of an abstract question, but so we talked about the leadership models and who Misha Saakashvili, that he had this dream of modeling himself after David the Builder, and now it's scaled back to George Washington. If you had do you have any, say you had a dream model for who you hoped Obama would most model himself after?
In terms of one of these sort of quasi-mythical.
Maybe it doesn't have to be so kind of self-aggrandizingly mythical as George Washington.
Well, but they all are, right? I mean, that's the whole point, right? It's not just Lincoln; it's the myth of Lincoln. Someone who this is interesting, and I probably had some thoughts on this that I don't recollect right now exactly.
Although I would just, and maybe it's unfair, I've been thinking about this a little bit earlier today and kind of pouring it over, so I sprung it on you cruelly, but...
So what are your thoughts? Maybe
he loves Lincoln. I think he tries to model himself after Lincoln. I think that's great to a lot of degrees. I mean, if I were him, I guess Lincoln was a great lover of Shakespeare. Obama, I don't know. I would read... This is going to seem sort of esoteric, but I would read Henry IV, both of those plays, and then Henry V, because just in terms of the kind of problems about setting tone and maintaining his image that he may encounter, when I think of a kind of political figure that his life path has been similar to, it's by no means a perfect analogy, but you think of Prince Hal in Shakespeare, and the whole appeal of him
Jeremiah Wright,
was that he came from he hung out with seedy types who weren't in the mainstream kind of proper society. There was Falstaff for Prince Hal, obviously, and the kind of appeal that he had was that he consciously built his life around a trajectory, which is he'd been a rogue, and this is to some degree, this is a certain theme of dreams of my father. Not, I don't think Obama was ever as kind of totally off the rails as Prince Hal was, but built, he's kind of a rogue, and he had no experience. He hadn't done that much in his life, and then, he kind of came from not really having those expectations to making this amazing oration and doing this and killing Hotspur, who was kind of the young, ambitious, perfect Hillary of his time. Again, this analogy is not perfect at all, and this was his main accomplishment. It is really only accomplishment. And then he became king with these huge, he was just a mythical figure already, I think, because of this, of the kind of meteoric rise from being a do-nothing sort of random person into this slayer of dragons. And anyway, if I were him, I would read Henry V and see kind of how.
It's interesting because when you're talking about that,
obviously that guy's fictional.
Right. Henry V wasn't that fictional, but
Shakespearean representation.
Well, I mean, here's the thing, though. I mean, because I've thought about, the parallel between a particular American figure and Prince Hal has occurred to me before, but it was George W. Bush, right? That really struck me as a sort of a failed, but that struck me as actually quite similar in some ways to the Prince Hal of the first two. Of the Henry IV plays, and I think in self-image is very much the King Henry V. I think he envisions himself giving the St. Crispin's Day speech and so forth, and so it seems to me that George Bush, in a sense, fit very well into that mold. I know it's kind of interesting.
Much more than Kerry or Gore. I mean,
right.
These two men both have these kind of titanic narratives to their lives, and great cinematic material. I mean, both Bush and Obama, and there's something not totally dissimilar about their rise, but obviously the tone. Obama's so serious, and Bush is like eternally playful, even at totally inappropriate moments.
Right.
So that will be completely different. I hope. One can only hope. Blank slate. Tabula rasa. That's my dream. But it was great to talk to you.
Yeah, no, it's a fun conversation. I mean, we had hoped, Blogging Heads listeners and watchers who have probably stopped listening by now, we had hoped to be much more aggressive in terms of disagreement. I think we failed in that, actually.
I think we did fail. Well,
which is actually, I think because I'm too agreeable of a guy. I think people regularly complain about that in the comment sections of these. So.
Oh, really? I don't look at my comments. It would probably be a bloodbath. So maybe
it's kind of
that should be
tends
your new
to be kind of
tag.
depressing. So.
Well, next time in Jerusalem and with more anger and disagreements.
Right, exactly.
But interesting to talk to you, and hope you're looking forward to the end of this interregnum as much as I am. And until next time.
Right. Yes, exactly.
Great.
Been a lot of fun. Bye-bye.